August 8th, 1973. Pasadena, Texas. 3 in the morning. A 17-year-old boy named Wayne Henley called the police from a house on Lamar Drive and told them he had just shot a man. The officer who took the call expected a domestic dispute, a bar fight gone wrong. Something routine for a Thursday night in a Houston suburb in the early 70s. A city in the middle of its oil boom, noisy and fast, and full of the ordinary human chaos that keeps police dispatchers busy at 3 in the morning. What he got instead was the beginning of the worst discovery in the history of American law enforcement up to that point. When detectives arrived at the house, they found a body on the floor. Dean Arnold Corll, 33 years old, shot 6 times. He had been hit in the chest and the back and the lungs, and he had bled out on the linoleum floor of his own kitchen. He was wearing a short-sleeved shirt and jeans, dressed for a warm Texas night. Wayne Henley was standing nearby, calm in the way that people are sometimes calm after something has broken inside them so completely that there is nothing left to hold in. He had been 17 for less than 2 months. He looked younger than that. He told the officers there was something they needed to know. Something that couldn't wait. Something that had been waiting, in fact, for years. He knew where the bodies were. Bodies, plural. The detectives looked at each other. Over the next 2 days, Wayne Henley and another teenager named David Brooks led investigators to 4 separate locations across the Houston area and its outskirts. A metal storage shed off a narrow dead-end road about 9 miles southwest of downtown. A beach at High Island on the Gulf Coast, a wooded property in San Augustine County, a cabin near Lake Sam Rayburn. At each location, they dug. They kept digging. They kept finding more. 28 bodies in all, boys and young men, teenage boys. The youngest was 13 years old. The oldest was 20. Most of them were from the neighborhood known as the Heights. The same working-class streets where the Corll family had run their candy factory, where Dean Corll had handed out sweets at the playground, where parents had been filing missing persons reports for 3 years and being told every single time that their sons had probably just run away. The word serial killer had not yet entered the American vocabulary. FBI agents wouldn't coin the term for another 2 years. There was no language yet for what investigators were standing in front of. There was only the dirt floor of a storage shed and the shovels and the smell of a Texas summer pressing down on everything, and a list of names that grew longer with every hour that passed as the news spread across Houston and then across the country. Dean Corll had lived in the Heights for years. Everyone knew him as the Candyman, a nickname he'd earned by handing out free sweets near the elementary school where his mother's candy factory operated. He was always smiling. He had a steady job as an electrician with Houston Lighting and Power. He fixed things around the neighborhood when people needed help. He was quiet, reliable, the kind of man who doesn't give you any particular reason to think about him twice. The boys who had been vanishing from the Heights, one after another for 3 years, had been dismissed as runaways. Nobody had been looking for them, and therefore nobody had been looking for him. Dean Arnold Corll was born on Christmas Eve of 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana, a detail that his mother, Mary, would have considered meaningful in the way that religious women consider meaningful coincidences of timing. He was the first of 2 sons, and from the beginning he was the one she kept closest. His parents' marriage was a sustained, low-grade conflict that eventually became something worse. His father, Arnold, was a strict and often cold man, military in his bearing and his expectations, prone to criticism over praise, the kind of father who communicates love primarily through silence and disappointment, primarily through volume. His mother, Mary, was the counterweight, intensely protective of her sons, compensating for whatever the household lacked in warmth by making Dean and his brother Stanley the entire focus of her attention and energy. This particular dynamic, a rejecting father and a mother whose love was total and possessive, produced something in Dean Corll that was difficult to see at the time and easier to trace in retrospect. He was quiet, cooperative, eager to please in the careful way of a child who has learned that approval is not a given, that you have to earn it and keep earning it, and that the best strategy is to be exactly what the person in front of you wants you to be. His parents divorced when Dean was 7. The same year, he contracted rheumatic fever, a serious illness that in children can affect the heart and requires extended rest. Dean spent months out of school, away from physical activity, closer to home than other boys his age, closer to his mother, in the domestic spaces where she moved and worked and kept house. He learned her rhythms. He learned what made her happy. He learned how to be useful in a household. When Mary eventually remarried, a man named Jake West, the family relocated through several southern cities, eventually settling in Vidor, Texas, where Jake and Mary started a small candy operation out of the family garage, producing pecan candies and other sweets under the name Pecan Prince. Dean and his brother worked in the business after school. Dean measured ingredients, ran the machinery, helped box the product. He was methodical and reliable. He didn't complain. He learned how sweet things were made. The business eventually outgrew the garage and relocated to Houston, to the neighborhood known as the Heights, a working-class residential area just north of downtown that had once been an independent city before being absorbed by Houston's growth, and which had spent the subsequent decades slowly declining as investment and attention moved elsewhere. By the mid-1960s, the Heights was the kind of neighborhood where the Victorian houses had been cut into apartments and rented out, where families lived in close proximity and knew each other's names, where children ran freely through the streets in the afternoons and the adults sat on porches and watched everything. The Corll Candy Factory was on West 22nd Street near Helms Elementary School. Dean worked there alongside his mother, and the operation gave him something he had always possessed and was learning to deploy more deliberately: a reason to be around children. He handed out free candy at the school fence. He was friendly and accessible and always smiling. The kids called him the Candy Man, and the name stuck with the ease that nicknames stick when they feel exactly right. One of the children who came around regularly was a boy named David Brooks. 12 years old, he lived nearby. He found in Corll something he was not getting at home: attention, generosity, the particular feeling of being seen by an adult who seemed genuinely interested in you as a person. Corll gave him candy, then money, then more money, then a car. This was the beginning of everything. Dean Corll served briefly in the army, 10 months in 1964 before being discharged, and returned to Houston, where he eventually secured a position as an electrician with Houston Lighting and Power Company. Reliable work, good pay by the standards of the neighborhood. He drove a company truck. He carried tools. He wore a uniform that communicated competence and legitimacy. His mother had remarried again and moved to Colorado. Dean stayed behind. He began moving through apartments, renting a place, staying a few months, moving on. He moved more frequently than circumstances required. He moved often enough that no set of neighbors ever had time to accumulate enough information about him to form a picture. You knew him as a quiet guy, reliable, kept to himself. Then he was gone before you'd learned much else, and someone new was in the apartment. What he had, by the time the murders began in 1970, was a system and 2 teenagers. David Brooks had been in Corll's orbit since childhood. The gifts had continued: money, a car, access to things that a teenage boy from a working-class neighborhood in the Heights didn't otherwise have. By 1970, Brooks understood, or partly understood, what Corll was and what Corll wanted. He had been witness to enough that returning to innocence was no longer an option. Corll had leverage over him, The knowledge that Brooks carried made Brooks complicit, and complicity made the idea of going to the police feel not just frightening, but logically incoherent. Who would believe a teenager, and what exactly would he say? Through Brooks, Corll was introduced to Wayne Henley. Henley was 15 years old in 1971, the son of a recently divorced couple, a boy whose home life had become difficult and whose school career had stalled, held back a grade, bored, restless, doing the things that bored and restless teenagers do in neighborhoods where there isn't much else available. He had wanted, in some earlier version of himself, to be a minister. He read the Bible. He had a grandmother and a mother who had raised him to believe that there were things worth protecting. Brooks told him about a man who had an apartment where teenagers could hang out, drink, get high, no questions asked. A relaxed adult who didn't make you feel like you were doing something wrong. Corll met him, offered him money. Not for much, he explained, just to invite some friends around sometimes. Easy money, $200. For a 15-year-old with empty pockets and no particular direction, $200 was not a small number. The first time Henley understood what the parties actually were, what happened at the apartment, what Corll was actually doing, Corll told him calmly and specifically that it was already too late, that Wayne had been part of it now, that he had been present, that if he went to the police, the best he could expect was prison, that there was also a network, a syndicate of men who protected each other, who would come for Wayne and his family if anything happened to Corll. There was no syndicate, there was only Corll and the specific calculated lie he told to a 15-year-old who had no one to turn to and no framework for what he was being told. Wayne stayed. He told himself at first that he could manage it, that he could be around the edges of it without being inside it, that he could hold the line. At some point he kept moving further back. He could not. The Heights in 1970 was a neighborhood where boys went missing and people noticed. But the institution that was supposed to help had decided without investigation that it already knew the answer. Runaways. The Houston Police Department in the early 1970s was understaffed, underfunded, and operating in a city that was growing faster than its institutions could manage. Houston in that era was in the middle of its oil boom. The skyline was changing, the suburbs were expanding, the population was surging, and the police department was trying to cover all of it with resources that hadn't kept pace. The Heights was poor. It was not a priority. There was also a cultural narrative running through American law enforcement at that moment that made the runaway explanation feel obvious and sufficient. It was 1970, 1971, 1972. Teenagers were leaving home to join the counterculture. They were fleeing the Vietnam draft. They were going to San Francisco, to communes, to wherever the 60s was still technically happening. When a teenage boy from a working-class neighborhood disappeared without explanation, the simplest story, the one that required the least paperwork and no investigation, was that he had made a choice and left. Some boys even had letters. Corll required his victims to write postcards before he killed them, messages to their parents in their own handwriting, saying they had found work in Dallas or Austin or somewhere else in Texas, that they were fine, not to worry. The boys were frightened when they wrote these letters. Witnesses who survived described the handwriting as shaky, the phrasing stilted. But the letters were in the right hand, on real paper, with real stamps. When a mother brought one of these letters to the police station and said, "This doesn't sound like my son. I don't believe he wrote this voluntarily," officers looked at the handwriting, decided it matched, and sent her home. Case closed. This happened not once but repeatedly. The same neighborhood, the same age range, the same police response, the same parents sent home. Donna Scott had filed a missing persons report for her 14-year-old son, Charles, in September of 1970. He had vanished after going out with friends one evening. She went to the police, explained that Charles was not the kind of boy who ran away, that something was wrong. They told her teenagers made their own choices sometimes. She went home, She would wait 3 years. Fred and Dorothy Hilligiest lost their son David in May of 1971. He was 14 and he had gone to the public pool with his friend Mally Winkle, 16. Neither boy came home. The police had a record of a phone call David had supposedly made to his mother that evening, saying he was at the beach with friends. They marked it a runaway case and filed it. Dorothy Hilligiest did not accept this. She knew her son. She knew the specific way he talked to her on the phone, the things he said when he called, the texture of his actual voice versus the version in that message. She went back to the police station. She was told that teenagers made choices sometimes and that parents often didn't know their children as well as they believed. She hired a private investigator with money her family did not have. The investigator found nothing. She kept talking to other parents. She kept going to the police station. She kept pushing. The police found her persistence, by all available accounts, more tiresome than compelling. Meanwhile, Donna Scott was going through the same thing for her son Charles, who had disappeared the previous September. Selma Winkle was going through it for Mally, who had disappeared the same day as David Hilligiest, with David walking to the same pool. Frank Aguirre's family. The families of Charles Corll and Marty Jones, who had vanished together in December of 1970. These parents knew each other, or came to know each other, through the Heights, in the way that parents in small, close neighborhoods inevitably do. They talked to each other. They compared notes. They started to see what should have been visible to anyone with access to the police department's own files. 25 boys from the same streets within the same years, filed as runaways, never connected to each other, never investigated. Dorothy Hilligiest eventually brought what she had found directly to the police, with names and dates and addresses. She had done the cross-referencing herself by hand, in the way that it would have taken a detective an afternoon to do if anyone had thought to assign one to the task. She was told that teenage runaways were a common problem, and that there was nothing more that could be done. Her son's body was in a storage shed 9 miles from the police station the whole time. This is the thing that the official explanations, understaffing, underfunding, the absence of a conceptual framework for serial murder, can account for in the abstract, but cannot quite account for in the specific. Because there was a woman standing at a counter with a list of names and dates, and she had done the work, and the person on the other side of the counter looked at what she had done and sent her home. Not because they didn't have the information, because they had decided at some point that predated Dorothy Hilligiest and would outlast her, that certain children were not worth the resources their disappearance would require. The Heights in those years was not only where the victims came from, it was where the Candyman had built his reputation. Corll moved through a series of apartments during the killing years, never staying long in one place, always moving before neighbors accumulated enough observations to form questions. But his history in the Heights, his connection to the neighborhood through the candy factory, and his mother's business gave him a kind of standing that a stranger would not have had. People knew his name, they knew his mother, they associated him with sweetness, with generosity, with that particular pleasant neighbor quality of a man who is always around and never any trouble. Boys from the Heights came to his apartments for parties that Henley and Brooks organized and promoted through their own social networks. There would be beer and something to smoke and music, and the easy freedom of being somewhere an adult was present but not in charge. Corll was hospitable. He was relaxed. He let the boys do what they wanted without lecturing them about it. The invitations spread through word of mouth, the way invitations do among teenagers when there's somewhere good to go. Kids told friends. Friends told other friends. Some of the boys who came to those parties had known Corll since childhood, had been to the candy factory as small boys, had taken sweets from his hand at the school fence. He was familiar. He was safe. He was not safe. The system Corll had developed with Henley and Brooks was efficient in the specific way of something that has been refined through practice. Henley or Brooks would invite a boy to come along to a party, something casual, low pressure, the way you invite a friend to hang out. The destination was Corll's current apartment, or occasionally the cabin outside the city that Corll's family owned. Once a boy arrived, there would be drugs and alcohol to smooth the evening's edges. Corll would be present, but not dominant. Genial, available, one adult in a room full of teenagers having a good time. When the moment came, it came quickly. Corll had built the torture board himself, 8 feet long and 2.5 feet wide, fitted with restraints at the wrists and ankles. He kept it in his apartment or transported it between locations in his truck. It was the physical center of what he did to the boys who came to his parties and did not leave. Investigators would find it in his final apartment in Pasadena, along with plastic sheeting, rope, and a .22 caliber pistol. None of them were released. Corll killed by strangulation or gunshot. He buried his victims at 4 sites around the Houston area, with the largest number, 17, in the storage shed. Some were buried in individual graves. Some were buried together. He used lime to accelerate decomposition, a precaution he had evidently researched and applied with the same methodical care he brought to everything else. Between 1970 and 1973, he moved through 14 known addresses. Every time he moved, he left no trail that connected him to the boys who had been at his previous address. Every time police came to the Heights with another runaway case, the same file was closed, the same parents were sent home, and the same man was driving his electric company truck through the streets of Houston with his always present smile and his reputation as a good neighbor fully intact. The victims of Dean Corll ranged in age from 13 to 20 years old. Most were from the Heights or its adjacent neighborhoods, streets within walking distance of each other, streets whose names the families all recognized, streets where kids knew each other from school and from church and from playing in the same yards. Their names were recorded only after everything was over, in the grim process of matching decomposed remains to missing persons reports and dental records, and the memories of families who had spent months or years assuming that their sons had chosen to leave. Stanton Draymala was 13 years old, the youngest confirmed victim. He was the last boy to be added to the list before the night Wayne Henley ended it. His parents would spend the next 50 years attending parole hearings for Henley, making the same journey, sitting in the same rooms, saying the same things about what had been taken from them. They are, as of the last available accounts, still alive, still going. David Hilligiest was 14. He had been to the Corll candy factory as a small boy. His mother had once come to collect him because he had spent so long there that she had grown worried. He knew the building. He had taken candy from the man who killed him. Mally Winkle was 16, and his mother had worked at the candy factory alongside Corll. He had grown up seeing this man as part of the landscape of his life. Billy Lawrence was 17, one of the last victims, taken in July of 1973, less than a month before the night Henley finally fired the shots that ended it. His family had known the Corll family for years through the neighborhood. These connections, these threads of ordinary community life that ran between the killer and his victims, are part of what makes the Houston case distinct from other crimes of this scale. This was not a stranger moving through unfamiliar territory, hunting people he had no prior relationship with. This was a man embedded in a specific community, known by name to the families of the boys he killed, present at the school fence and the neighborhood gatherings and the ordinary social events that make up the texture of life in a close neighborhood. Some of his victims had known him since they were old enough to take candy from someone's hand. He used that familiarity. He relied on it. The smile that the neighborhood associated with generosity and accessibility was the same smile he wore at his apartment door when the boys arrived for parties they would not leave. Jeffrey Conan was the first confirmed victim, 18 years old, a student at the University of Texas in Austin who was hitchhiking back to Houston. Corll picked him up in September of 1970. His family reported him missing. Police concluded he was probably traveling. Charles Cobble and Marty Jones vanished together in December of 1970, both teenagers, both from the Heights. The police opened 2 runaway files. Frank Aguirre disappeared in February of 1971, 17 years old. His family was Mexican-American, part of the Heights community that had been there for generations. The police filed a runaway report. The list continued building through 1971 through 1972, which was the single most concentrated period of killing, with 13 victims in approximately 6 months, and into 1973. 25 missing persons reports from the same neighborhood, handled separately, filed separately, never cross-referenced, never connected to each other or to the name of a man who appeared on none of them, but whose apartment had been the last known location of several of the boys on the list. The families were not quiet about this. They made noise. They went back to the police station repeatedly. Some hired private investigators with money they couldn't afford to spend. Dorothy Hilligist, who had lost her son David in May of 1971, spent 2 years doing the investigation that the police wouldn't do, talking to other parents, mapping the disappearances, building a picture of the pattern that was visible to anyone who looked. She brought what she had found to the police. They thanked her for her concern and filed her information, and did nothing. Her son was in the storage shed the whole time. Less than 10 miles from the police station where she had stood and pleaded for someone to listen. The morning of August 9th, 1973, the day after Henley shot Corll, detectives drove to a metal storage shed located off a narrow dead-end road about 9 miles southwest of downtown Houston. The shed had been rented by Corll under his own name. The bill had been paid on time every month. It was a perfectly ordinary commercial rental, the kind that keeps a paper record and asks no questions about what is being stored inside. Henley told them to start digging in the dirt floor. The shed measured about 20 feet by 15 feet. Inside, the air was wrong. Experienced investigators learned to recognize the particular quality of enclosed spaces where decomposition has occurred, the way it registers before any other sense confirms it. The dirt floor was packed and apparently undisturbed. Investigators broke through the surface with shovels. Almost immediately, they found evidence of what had been done there. 17 bodies. In the shed alone. 17 boys and young men, buried in the dirt floor of a storage rental that had been in use for 3 years, paid for on time every month, rented to a man whose name appeared on none of the missing persons reports that the Houston Police Department had filed and closed and filed again over the same 3 years. Decomposition in a Texas summer is rapid and merciless. Not all of the remains were identifiable immediately. The work of identification, dental records, personal effects, descriptions of clothing from families who remembered what their sons had been wearing the last day anyone saw them, would take weeks and would leave some questions permanently open. When news of the discovery was broadcast that evening, the Heights went quiet in the way that places go quiet when a large number of people receive information that changes everything they thought they knew. Families who had spent months or years waiting, who had accepted the runaway explanation or rejected it without being able to prove otherwise, sat in front of their televisions and underwent the particular devastation of being right about the worst possible thing. Dorothy Hilligist was in her living room. The reporter on screen was saying a name, Dean Corll, and saying the Heights and saying bodies. She understood immediately. She had known since May of 1971. She had tried every avenue available to her. She had stood at police counters and been politely dismissed. She had spent money her family didn't have. She had talked to other parents and built a picture of a pattern that was visible to anyone who looked. Her son was in that shed the whole time, less than 10 miles away. In the days that followed, Henley and Brooks led investigators to 3 more burial sites. A stretch of beach at High Island on the Gulf Coast, a wooded property in San Augustine County, a remote area near Lake Sam Rayburn. 28 confirmed victims in total. The case was reported in the New York Times as the largest multiple murder case in United States history. The record stood for 5 years, until John Wayne Gacy's victims were found beneath a Chicago suburb. One victim has never been identified. A boy between 15 and 18 years old, found in the storage shed wearing a swimsuit, known in the case files by a reference number. Forensic artists produced a reconstruction of his face and distributed it widely. Nobody recognized him. As of the most recent forensic efforts in 2025, he remains unidentified. His family may not know he was ever missing. Corll had required the boys to write postcards before he killed them. Messages home in their own handwriting saying they had taken a job in Dallas or were traveling and would be in touch. The handwriting was shaky. Witnesses who survived described being frightened when they wrote, but it was the right hand on real paper. When parents brought these cards to the police filed them as evidence of voluntary departure. Detective David Mullican, who worked the case, said in an interview in 2011, "How that man was able to go out to that storage shed time after time and bury one more dead boy is something I'll never understand. You get close to evil like that, no matter how long ago it was, and it never leaves you." There is one more detail about Dean Corll in the days before he died that appears in the Texas Monthly Investigation and has stayed in the record. 4 days before Henley shot him, Corll called his mother in Colorado. He told her he was in trouble, that he was afraid he was losing his mind, that he might hurt himself. She sent him a box of candy. She did not know. There is no reason at all to believe she knew what her son had been doing in Houston for 3 years, but the image has a particular unshakable quality. A man 4 days from death calling the woman who had built the business that gave him his nickname and his access and his standing in the neighborhood, telling her something was wrong and receiving in return a box of the thing that had made the children trust him. He was dead 4 days later. The candy arrived after he was gone. For the murders of 6 of the known victims, he received 6 99-year sentences. Under Texas law at the time, these were eventually consolidated into terms running concurrently, which made parole theoretically possible after a number of years. He has been in prison ever since. The trials attracted national attention in the same way the original discovery had. Here was something that didn't fit into any existing story about how the world worked, and the country was still trying to find the frame. Henley was 17. He had shot the man who had groomed and coerced him, potentially saving 2 lives in the process. He had then led police to the bodies and cooperated fully with the investigation. He had given testimony that was, by all accounts, accurate and detailed, and essential to the prosecution of the related cases. He had also participated in murders. He had lured boys to their deaths. He had helped dispose of bodies. Whatever Corll had done to bring him to that place, and the forensic psychological literature on coercion and grooming, and the particular vulnerability of teenagers to sustained manipulation is extensive. Wayne Henley had also done things. The jury found him guilty of 6 murders. The sentence was 99 years, 6 times. David Brooks was convicted separately of murder with malice. He received a life sentence. He applied for parole multiple times over the decades. He was denied each time. He died in prison in April of 2020 at the age of 66 from COVID-19. He never spoke publicly about the case in the way Henley did. He left behind fewer words. His record in the case, the things he admitted to, the things he denied, the years of his teenage life spent in Corll's orbit before Corll found Henley, sits in the court record, read by researchers and journalists and the families of victims who wanted to understand how it had worked. Henley, by contrast, has talked. Over the decades, he has given interviews to researchers, journalists, and documentarians. He spoke at length with Dr. Catherine Ramsland, whose work on the psychology of coercion and serial killers led her to the Houston case as one of its most documented examples. He participated in the investigation discovery documentary The Serial Killer's Apprentice, released in 2025, which presented recorded conversations between Henley and Ramsland alongside archival and investigative material. In those conversations, Henley described the process of being brought into Corll's system, the money that seemed simple, the knowledge that came with proximity, the entrapment that Corll maintained deliberately through threats, through the fiction of the syndicate, through the constant reinforcement that the only future available to Henley was to continue. He described losing the ability to imagine a way out. He described the moment he fired the gun. He has said that he cannot undo what he did, that there is no making it right for the families, that the only thing he can offer is honesty about what happened, and the hope that this honesty is worth something to someone. Whether it is worth something is a question that nobody can answer on behalf of the families of 28 boys. Henley became eligible for parole in 2025 at the age of 69. The hearing took place. The families attended, those who were still living, those who could make the journey, those who had been attending these hearings for decades and intended to keep attending them until either Henley died in prison or they did. The parole board denied the application. The case made things change in American law enforcement. Though change is a word that requires careful use here because the changes came after, and the after was too late for 28 families. Procedures for handling missing children were revised. The idea of cross-referencing reports from the same geographic area over time, of asking why so many people from the same few blocks were disappearing in the same span of years, became part of what investigators were trained to do. The category of runaway was examined as a default classification and found to be inadequate, particularly for cases involving teenage boys from low-income neighborhoods. The FBI's development of behavioral profiling, which accelerated through the mid-1970s and the early 1980s, drew on cases like the Houston mass murders as foundational examples of what predators who operated over extended periods looked like from the outside: ordinary, embedded in community, possessed of legitimate reasons to be around their victims. The Candyman became part of the curriculum. Child protection legislation was strengthened in multiple states. The idea that police departments had an obligation to investigate missing children, regardless of their class background, regardless of the convenient narrative about runaways, was codified in ways it had not been before. All of this was true. All of this came after. Dorothy Hilligiest, who had known from May of 1971 that something was wrong and had been told by everyone she approached that she was mistaken. She was right. She was right for 3 years while the police had her son's case filed as a runaway, and the man who had killed him was paying his storage bill on time every month. She spent the rest of her life with this knowledge, the knowledge that she had been right, the knowledge that the system that was supposed to help had failed so completely that it had functioned in practice as protection for the man who killed her son, not by design, not out of malice, out of indifference and underfunding, and the specific, centuries-old American tendency to value some lives more than others, and to build institutions that reflect this tendency in their operating procedures. This is the legacy of the Houston mass murders. Not the number, not the horror of the storage shed. The letters. 28 boys in shaky handwriting. mothers at police counters, officers sending them home, and the Candyman still smiling, still driving his truck through the streets of a city that never asked where all the boys were going. There is a detail from the night of August 8th, 1973, that stays with anyone who spends time with this case. Henley had brought two friends to Corll's house that night. Tim Curley, 20 years old, Rhonda Williams, 15. Corll had not been expecting a girl. He was angry about this from the moment they arrived, visibly irritated, pressuring Henley about it, making clear that this was not what the arrangement was supposed to look like. But the evening started anyway. Beer, acrylic paint fumes, huffing paint to get high was something teenagers in that neighborhood and era did, a cheap and available method that produced a brief dissociative state. All four of them were in the apartment. The night got later. At some point they all passed out. When they woke up, they were bound. Corll had tied all three of them, Henley included, while they were unconscious. He had the restraints ready because he always had the restraints ready. He told them what he intended to do. He told Henley specifically what he intended to do to Tim and Rhonda, and he told Henley what Henley's role would be in it, and he told Henley that if Henley participated, Henley would be allowed to leave afterward. Henley would later describe this moment to criminologist Dr. Catherine Ramsland in recorded conversations that formed the basis for her book and documentary on the case. He said that he had been raised by his mother, by his grandmother, to protect women. That whatever had happened to him over the previous 2 years, whatever pieces of himself he had surrendered to get through each day, this particular line remained. He could not do what Corll was describing. Not to Rhonda. Not with Rhonda watching him. He told Corll he needed to think. He kept talking. He talked for long enough that Corll's attention shifted slightly. Long enough that the restraints on Henley's wrists worked loose. Long enough that a moment appeared. He grabbed Corll's .22 caliber pistol from the floor where it had been placed. He shot him. The first shot hit Corll in the chest. Corll staggered backward, but did not fall. He looked at Henley with an expression that the surviving witnesses described as confused more than afraid. The expression perhaps of a man who had spent 3 years constructing a world in which he was in complete control, encountering the first piece of evidence that this was not true. Henley fired again, and again. 6 shots in total. Corll fell to the floor of his own kitchen. Henley stood over him for a moment. Then he went to the phone, called the police, told the dispatcher he had shot someone, and gave the address. He set the phone down. He freed Tim and Rhonda from their restraints. He sat down in a chair and waited for the police to arrive. Tim Curley, once freed and once he had understood what had just happened, felt something he spent years afterward trying to articulate. Gratitude and horror simultaneously. An impossible debt owed to a person who was also responsible for the deaths of the boys whose names would fill the news over the following days. He later testified to his gratitude. He said he thought about August 8th, 1973, for the rest of his life. He said he did not know how to hold both things in his mind at the same time, what Henley had done that morning and what Henley had also done over the previous 2 years. Nobody who spent time with this case ever figured out how to hold both things at the same time. Before Henley fired those 6 shots, he reportedly screamed at Corll, "I can't go on any longer. I can't have you kill all my friends." He was 17 years old. The people who study coercion and grooming and the particular psychology of how adults gain control over young people point to Henley's case as one of the more documented examples of what that process looks like when it works on a specific kind of vulnerable teenager. He entered Corll's orbit at 15, poor, troubled, looking for direction. He was offered money for something simple. The simple thing led to knowledge. The knowledge led to implication. The implication led to a condition of entrapment that Corll maintained deliberately. The threats, the fake syndicate, the constant reinforcement that going to the police would destroy Henley before it could help anyone. Henley described to Ramsland that he had, during those years, stopped being able to imagine a way out. The future had simply become, continue doing what Corll requires, or face consequences Corll had described in specific and convincing terms. The concept of going to an adult, to a teacher, to a police officer, of there being any trustworthy institution that might help, had been systematically removed from the range of options he could conceive of. This is what predators do when they are methodical about it. This is what Corll had been. The Houston mass murders changed things, but not immediately, and not the way change is supposed to look. The Houston Police Department faced questions that it could not answer satisfactorily about what had happened. 25 missing persons reports from the same neighborhood over 3 years. Families who had come repeatedly, pleading for investigation and been turned away. Parents who had hired private investigators with money they couldn't afford because the police had declined to use the resources they had. A storage shed 9 miles from the station where 17 boys were buried, rented by a man whose name appeared on none of the files the department had accumulated over those same 3 years. The explanation that emerged, and it was an explanation rather than an accounting, was structural. The Heights was a poor neighborhood in an understaffed, underfunded department covering a rapidly growing city. Teenage boys from poor neighborhoods who went missing were categorized as runaways by default, and the default required no investigation and generated no follow-up. The term serial killer hadn't been coined yet, so there was no conceptual framework for connecting individual disappearances into a pattern. The department had no mechanism for cross-referencing missing persons reports from the same area over time. All of these things are true. They are also the precise conditions that Corll had relied upon. He had not created those conditions. He had not needed to. He had found them already in place and worked within them with the efficiency of someone who understood how the system was structured and where its gaps were. This is the thing that separates the Houston case from crimes that happened in spite of the institutions around them. This happened because of the institutions around it. The police department's indifference to poor teenagers from working-class neighborhoods was not incidental to Corll's ability to operate for 3 years. It was load-bearing. The case also arrived at a moment when American law enforcement was in the early stages of confronting something it didn't yet have language for. FBI agents would coin the term serial killer in the mid-1970s, partly as a result of working through what the Houston case and cases like it represented. Robert Ressler, who developed the term and the behavioral profiling methodology that followed it, cited cases from this era as the practical foundation of what became systematic. What Corll had done was one of the cases that made the framework necessary. In Houston, the practical consequences were more immediate and more personal. The parents of the victims formed connections through the investigation and the hearings and the years of follow-up that outlasted all of the institutional involvement. They attended court proceedings together. They supported each other through the parole hearings that began when Henley became eligible and that continued at regular intervals for decades. They kept each other informed about forensic updates, about identification efforts, about the unidentified boy in the swimsuit who remained a name on a form rather than a name on a headstone. The parents of Stanton Draymala, who was 13 years old, the youngest of Corll's confirmed victims, attended every single parole hearing for Wayne Henley from his first eligibility through the most recent. Every one. Making the same journey, sitting in the same kind of room, speaking the same kind of words about what their son had been and what had been taken from him and why the man sitting across the table should not be free. Henley applied for parole for the first time decades after his conviction. He was denied. He applied again. Denied again. The pattern continued. In 2025, he was in his late 60s, still in a Texas prison, still applying, the families still attending. David Brooks, who had been Corll's first accomplice, died in prison in 2020 from COVID-19. He was never paroled. The house on Lamar Drive in Pasadena where Corll died no longer stands. The storage shed has been long since demolished. The candy factory on West 22nd Street in the Heights is gone, replaced by something else, as most things in a city that grows as relentlessly as Houston eventually are replaced. The Heights itself has changed beyond recognition. What was a poor, declining neighborhood in the early 1970s is now a desirable address. Gentrified, renovated, full of restaurants and coffee shops, and the particular aesthetic of a working-class neighborhood that has been discovered by people with money. The streets where the boys lived and disappeared now look prosperous and maintained in ways they did not look in 1971 or 1972 or 1973. Some of the families still live there. Some moved away and couldn't go back. Some of the parents are gone now, having spent the years between their son's disappearance and their own death carrying the specific weight of a grief that never fully resolved. Detective Mulligan's words about getting close to evil and it never leaving you. Those words were said about a storage shed, about what it felt like to stand in a building and keep finding the same thing beneath the floor. Imagine what it felt like to be a parent and to know that your boy had been in that building under that floor for 3 years while you were trying to get someone to listen. The Lost Boys. That is the name they carry collectively now, a name that emerged from the journalism and the memorials and the decades of public memory that accumulated around the case, and that has stayed because it is accurate in more than one direction. Lost, not because they chose to go. Lost because a system that was supposed to see them had decided, without evidence and without investigation, that they had made a choice. Lost because a man with a candy factory and a ready smile had spent years building a presence in a specific neighborhood, had made himself familiar and trustworthy in the way that requires patience and consistency and a willingness to be exactly what people around you need you to be, and then had used that familiarity as the mechanism of access. Lost because 2 teenagers, recruited through the specific vulnerabilities of their ages and circumstances, had helped him do it, and because the methods used to keep them complicit were more sophisticated than anything the institutions around them were prepared to recognize or respond to. The case changed laws. It changed procedures. It changed how investigators were trained to think about missing persons patterns and the cross-referencing of reports from common geographic areas. But what the case did not do, what no case can do retroactively, was give back anything to the families who had done everything right and been failed completely. Donna Scott went to the police in September of 1970 and was told her son had probably run away. She was right that something was wrong. The police were wrong. Her son's body was in a shed 9 miles from where she filed the report. Dorothy Hilligiest went to the police and then went back, and then went back again, and then hired an investigator, and then brought a list of names to the counter and laid it down. The police looked at the list and sent her home. She was right. They were wrong. Her son's body was in the same shed. The mothers were right. The system was wrong. And the candy man kept smiling. He handed out sweets at the school fence, right up until his mother closed the factory and moved away. He drove his electric company truck through the streets of a city that was growing too fast to notice what was happening in its working-class neighborhoods. He rented a storage shed on a dead-end road and paid the bill on time, and nobody asked what was inside. He was, by the observable standards of the neighborhood and the era, a perfectly ordinary man. The boys who came to his apartment for parties were from the same streets where he had handed out candy as a child. Some of them had known him for years. Some of them had taken something from his hand at the fence near the elementary school and walked away thinking, "Nice man, always smiling, generous." The last thing many of them ever did was write a postcard home, in shaky handwriting because they were frightened, telling their parents they had found work, telling them not to worry, telling them they had made a choice to leave. The postcard would arrive a few days after they disappeared. Their parents would bring it to the police station. The police would look at it. Case closed, until the night that Wayne Henley woke up, bound in a house in Pasadena, grabbed a gun, and did the one thing that finally made someone pay attention. Dean Arnold Corll was dead at 33. 28 families finally had an answer. One family, the family of a boy found in a swimsuit, identified by a reference number whose face has been reconstructed and distributed and still not recognized, is still waiting. They may not even know they are waiting. They may have gotten a postcard. The Houston mass murders occupy a specific and significant place in the history of American crime, not just because of their scale, though the scale was unprecedented at the time, but because of what they exposed about the systems that were supposed to prevent them. Before this case, there was no standard procedure for cross-referencing missing persons reports from the same geographic area. There was no systematic way for a detective in one precinct to know that another detective across the city had filed a similar report last month. There was no established protocol for treating clusters of disappearances from a common neighborhood as potentially connected, rather than as a series of unrelated individual decisions by individual teenagers to leave home. After this case, there started to be. Not immediately, not smoothly. The changes came slowly and incompletely, the way institutional changes always do, driven by the public pressure that followed the initial discovery, then the investigations, then the reporting, then the books and the documentaries, and the decades of sustained attention that the families of the lost boys refused to let fade. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, which developed the framework for understanding serial predators that is now standard in law enforcement training, drew explicitly on cases like the Houston mass murders. What does a long-term predator who operates in plain sight look like from the outside? How do they build access? How do they maintain the conditions that allow them to continue? What should we be looking for in a community where a pattern of disappearances has appeared? The answers to those questions, the answers that now seem obvious, that are taught in academies and written into procedures, were built out of the cases where the questions weren't asked soon enough. Out of 28 families in Houston, out of the mothers who stood at police counters with lists and letters and the specific, unshakable certainty that their sons were not runaways and were sent home, out of a storage shed on a dead-end road. This is the thing about the Candyman that the Candyman himself never understood, or perhaps understood and simply didn't care about. That the conditions he exploited, the indifference, the underfunding, the institutional tendency to discount certain lives, were not permanent. That the families he relied upon to be invisible and powerless were neither. That the mothers he depended upon to be dismissed would simply keep coming back until someone finally, out of whatever combination of persistence and luck and timing and the particular tenacity of a woman who knows she is right, until someone finally listened. It took 3 years. It took 28 boys. But eventually, in a house in Pasadena on a Thursday night in August, someone did the one thing that made the whole edifice come down. Wayne Henley was 17 years old. He was frightened. He was bound. And he chose to protect a girl he barely knew because that was the one line he had not yet crossed, and because some things, apparently, survive even 3 years in Dean Corll's orbit. He grabbed the gun. and the Candyman's last smile left his face, and the boys in the ground finally had names again.